Korean is not a genre. I've been wanting to talk about this for a while, since around the time Parasite blew everyone's minds and we all fell in love with Park So-dam. Speaking of So-dam, send positive energy her way if you haven't. Parasite was a phenomenal movie, just one of the many phenomenal movies that Bong Joon-ho has made. I was first introduced to his work through The Host and quickly became obsessed with what he was doing. When Snowpiercer and Okja dropped, I was quick to see them and enjoyed them both. And when I heard he was filming Parasite, once again reuniting with Song Kang-ho, I was overjoyed. Anyway, the movie came out, was amazing, broke records. We know the story by now. I wanted to start with that because I love Bong's work and I loved Parasite. And I want to be clear that everything I'm about to say in regards to the talk surrounding Parasite at the time of its release, especially from Western journalists, has nothing to do with the film itself. Like, I have no problem with that movie. I have one problem with that movie. I didn't make it, but I digress. When Parasite began to grow in popularity, a lot of Western media journalists, media critics, Western media people, they would write these articles, which were really just lists, "Thank you for your contribution to journalism, BuzzFeed," where the gist was, if you like Parasite, you'll love insert movies completely different from Parasite in almost every conceivable way. It wasn't limited to the media people. Twitter users also played a hand in this, creating threads of movies that they deemed were similar to Parasite, that anyone who enjoyed the themes of Parasite would be able to follow the movie up with. The thing was, 9 times out of 10, these similar movies only had one thing in common, that they were Korean movies. That was it. And I understand some of these people only wanted for whoever was reading these lists to open their own door to Korean cinema, and I get that. It bugged me slightly then, only because they would choose things that weren't similar in tone or in theme, and if your article list thingy is movies you'll like if you enjoyed Parasite, shouldn't they share a certain vibe? What if I heard you enjoyed The Man from Nowhere and I said, oh wow, if you loved The Man from Nowhere, you'll love Sad Movie? No, you wouldn't. In a way, it felt like some people were treating Korean cinema as a monolith, when that's just not the case, obviously. And it didn't reflect the multifaceted scope of Korean cinema. Not every Korean film is a Train to Busan or a Parasite. What about the romantic comedies? What about the art house scene? What about the sapphic ghost stories? I was always gonna find a way to slip Memento Mori in there, let's not kid ourselves. Anyway, Parasite is where I really started to notice this, because when Train to Busan came out, although I saw it, I was not paying attention to how anyone was talking about it because I was in college and had less time to complain about things that don't matter. But I'm not in college now, so let the complaining begin. After Parasite became so big, a lot of American journalists were doing this thing where they were comparing any Korean movie they saw after Parasite to Parasite, even if they had no similarities whatsoever. Recently, I'm noticing the same thing happening. During last year's ginormous success of Squid Game, I would see American journalists doing the same damn thing that they did before. I have to assume most of these people don't have the broadest knowledge of Korean cinema, or even just Eastern cinema in general, because if they did, I doubt they would have to compare every Korean film they see to the other two that they saw. Also, oh my god, I remember one of the first reviews I read during Squid Game fever described it as a Hunger Games type of story. My Battle Royale ass was so pissed off when I read that, oh my god. Because Netflix had slated a bunch of Korean originals for release and had been working toward this since before Okja in 2017, a lot of other Korean shows were coming out around the same time. And bitch! Tell me why so many of them got compared to Squid Game even when they had nothing to do with those themes. The Silent Sea, a show about astronauts trying to retrieve samples from an abandoned research facility, is not like Squid Game, a show about contestants competing in death games for money. Well, butter my rump and call me toast, cause what the fuck? And I'm seeing the same thing happening again with All of Us Are Dead. It's getting compared to Squid Game non-stop, even though the only real similarity besides the violence of the two shows is that they're both Korean. It probably doesn't make sense why this bothers me, so let me put it like this. Squid Game is similar to Battle Royale with the death game theme, so let's use Battle Royale as an example. Now let's find a movie that came out around the same time as Battle Royale, but let's find one that's similar to All of Us Are Dead. I'm gonna go with 28 Days Later. What if 28 Days Later came out and some fuck media person was like, this movie isn't like Battle Royale at all, how disappointing. Comparing Netflix's new Korean sci-fi drama, The Silent Sea, with cultural phenomenon Squid Game feels inherently unfair. Yeah, it's unfair because it doesn't make sense. Oh, I think they're the same because Gong Yoo is in it and he was in Squid Game. And other news, guys, Don't Look Up is just like Basketball Diaries because Leonardo DiCaprio is in both, so feel free to compare the very similar themes of those movies. Maybe it shouldn't bother me so much, but it's like I said earlier, the tone of it all sees Korean cinema as this monolithic thing, where every movie is the same, or where people approach every Korean movie as if it's going to be on par with Parasite, or at least thematically similar, where they act as if every single Korean movie is going to be a Train to Busan, and if it's not, they're going to compare the two anyway because they're both Korean. I just can't imagine it happening very often that two American movies would be so frequently compared without the two of them sharing a similar theme or plot. Comparing Netflix's new unseasoned chicken of a movie, Red Notice, with Oscar contender The Lost Daughter feels inherently unfair, said no one ever. It turns a blind eye to historical fiction, to the comedies, the romances, the moody art house character observations, the films based on true events, and more importantly, it ignores the awful, shitty B-movies that are easy to love anyway on account of how fucking stupid they are, like The Divine Fury. It kind of reminds me of how K-pop is thought to strictly describe the idol groups when, in reality, K-pop encompasses the whole of the popular Korean music scene, which includes indie rock, hip-hop, and ballads. Oh my god, could it be? A chance to quote Min Yoon-gi? I'm a little careful to talk about K-pop as a genre, because I don't want to be defining K-pop as a genre. Reducing the complexity and the layeredness because that's a word, of Korean cinema to a handful of films is insulting to the industry and to its artists. And I know a big reason for this is that movies like Train to Busan, Old Boy, and Parasite all became popular globally, whereas a movie like Whispering Corridors is not. So naturally, people exposed to Korean cinema through these groundbreaking films are going to have that as their only point of reference for Korean cinema and what it looks like. I just ask that people don't become so close-minded when being introduced to art around the world that they've never really seen before. I just ask that people don't treat something that's new to them as if it's new overall. Korean cinema didn't just happen overnight. Through difficult history and constant disruptions of the film industry, Korean cinema persevered from war and occupation. It was able to build itself up time and time again. After the country's liberation, it was able to bloom completely. Consider Yoo Hyun-mok's Aimless Bullet, Shin Sang-uk's The House Guest and My Mother, which was actually the first South Korean film to be submitted for Best Foreign Picture at the 35th Academy Awards. I don't expect everyone to know the complete history of Korean cinema. I don't even know that, and asking anyone to know all of that would be ridiculous. I just expect for people to appreciate and acknowledge that it has a history, and that its history is rich and complex, and that Korean cinema as a whole is more than just the two movies and TV show that you watched and feel the need to compare everything to. Korean cinema was what I had in mind specifically because of the examples I mentioned earlier, but this is really a problem that Western media critics have in general when it comes to anything that isn't Western. This applies to all films made outside of America or Europe or Australia. Western media critics have a tendency to diminish an entire country's film industry to just one or two films that have broken through into global popularity. Anyway, that's all I have to say. Sorry for devolving into a rant. Also, if you liked Beast clawing at straws, you'll love A Moment to Remember.